Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Census Data Seminar for Tasmania. It is an absolutely wonderful pleasure to be here today. I've been delivering these data seminars for all of the states and territories across Australia, and today I get to deliver a data seminar for not only my home state, but the state where I'm actually present in right now. I was talking to my colleagues. Out the window from my home, I can see the lovely Derwent River, Mount Coonamble, Mount Wellington, and the city of Hobart for lands, for waterways which flow out into the seas, which are, for traditional custodians of which are the Palawa people. And I'd like to acknowledge the Palawa people and pay my respects to their continuing culture and their contribution they make to the life of this city and this region. I'd like to welcome all the members of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community that are joining us today. As I mentioned, this is my home state, so it's a great pleasure to be here to share the data. Hi, Mum. Hi, Dad. I'm sure you tuned in. And yet my family have just acknowledged 204 years is in the state since arrival, and so I feel a really deep connection to this place too, and so really proud out of our role as a national statistical agency to be able to collect the information that helps for the important decisions for Tasmania as we move forward. I am joined today by Mark Harding, who will be my co-presenter. He's a program manager of 2021 census data. And Mark's joining us from Sydney today. Also joined today by Lauren Binns, who's our strategic partnership manager for the ABS for Tasmania, and she'll help facilitate the questions later on in the session. So today's session, we will start by talking a little bit about the census in 2021 and about how we conducted the census during a pandemic. And I'll share a little bit of information on our quality indicators for a census. Then we'll get into the really exciting part of sharing the data from a census, and that's when I'll hand across to Mark to give you some of the real great insights we've seen about Tasmania and how Tasmania is changing. And we'll talk about some of our future releases, how you can access the data yourself, and an opportunity for you to ask us some questions. So how do you ask questions in this stream presentation? Well, you need to open up a browser window and go to polev.com/2021 census DS for data seminar TAS. And so we'll have that link up on a number of the slides during the session today, and we'll remind you as you go along. You can put in questions at any time, and we'll get through as many of those as we can at the end of the session today. So really looking forward to those. So a census is a massive logistical operation. We think the largest peacetime operation in Australia. For the census in 2021, we employed some 35,000 staff to conduct the census. That's more than a population of Devonport, so a huge workforce conducting the census. Each census takes over 7 years from planning to final data release. So I've already got a team of people working on 2026 census and all of our preparations for 2026, whilst we're still working on making sure that the great data from 2021 gets returned and to all Australians. But the large scale of census isn't enough of a challenge. We had to conduct a census last year during the second year of the COVID-19 pandemic. During the census collection period last year, we had nearly half the country were in lockdown at some stage during the collection period. So quite a different kind of environment for us to conduct the census. Tasmania wasn't in lockdown at the time, but we obviously had a range of changing border conditions and closures during that time, as well as a number of residents that were in isolation or quarantine during that period of time. What we saw in Tasmania was that 95% of Tasmanians were counted at home on census night, which is more than we've seen in the past. And obviously less Tasmanians would have been travelling interstate or overseas at census time. We had not a lot of interstate visitors at census time, only 5,000 people from other states staying in Tasmania on census night, and 17,000 Tasmanians were travelling somewhere within Tasmania away from their home on census night. And so whilst COVID meant we had to adapt a lot of our approaches to the census to try and make sure that we were being safe for our staff, but also safe for the community, we had a number of options for people to respond to the census. Obviously, we were a significant number responding online, but also through contactless procedures around the receiving paper forms and mailing them back to the ABS. And so what we've seen overall in the census is actually what we think is the most complete census data set we've collected in a modern era. So rather than missing out on 600,000 Australians temporarily overseas, which we did in 2016, nearly all of them were back in Australia and counted in the census. We're only about 39,000 Australians overseas on census night. Likewise, with less Australians and less Tasmanians travelling around the country on census night, it means our household statistics, our family statistics are even more complete than usual with lots of people back home. But also from a quality point of view, we saw in the census a really pleasing and really high response rate. What you can see on here is that across Australia, we had a 96.1% response rate. That means that 96% of all of the occupied private dwellings in Australia, we got a census form for, which is an amazing result, better than 2016 and higher than our quality targets. Here in Tasmania, we smashed that with 96.8%. It's not the best result in Australia. Unfortunately, we've fallen behind ACT and South Australia for two censuses in a row, but an improvement in response rate from 2016. So big thank you for all the Tasmanians for responding. But the next measure of quality we look at in a census is our net undercount. In order to get a net undercount, we actually have to run another survey. So after the census, we go out to 50,000 households across Australia and collect information from all of the residents of those households about where they might have been on census night. And then by linking this data up with a census, we're able to work out quite accurately how many people might have been counted twice in the census. Some people might have filled out a form in a hotel and at home, or children might have been filled out on a form at mother's house and father's house, where there's separated households, but also the number of people which have been missed on the census, people missed from households or households missed altogether. And so what we've seen there is that across the country, the lowest ever undercount we've seen in the census, so less than 1% undercount, and in Tasmania a 1.6% undercount. So our undercounts of each state and territory are often a little bit higher than the national kind of level, and a 1.6 net undercount. That means that when you look at the Tasmanian census counts, they're accurate to about 98.4% of a population. You add on about 1.6% to get the full count of what if every single person had been captured in the census. Online response rate as well, we've seen pleasing growths across the country. We've seen across Australia a 78.9% online response rate, so it's nearly 4 in every 5 census forms we got back. In Tasmania, we see a little bit of a lower online response rate with 61%, but that's still a significant increase from 2016, where it was only 45%. So it's increased by a bit more than a third from 2016 and only 30% in 2011. So climbing up there, but a little bit below. It's the lowest state in terms of response rate. Okay, enough about census quality. Let's get into learning a little bit more about the census data. We'll start from a people perspective. So overall in Australia, we counted 25,422,788 usual residents in Australia. The first time we've counted more than 25 million people in Australia, and our population grew by 8.6% nationally. What we can see on this slide is the percentage change of each state and territory in Australia. And you can see ACT, they've taken the crown there, 14.4%, the fastest growing territory in Australia for the second census in a row. Victoria, it's second at 9.7%, and Tasmania is slotting in there in third place, bronze medal, 9.3% growth. But that's quite a significant change for Tassie compared to the growth rate in the previous 5 years. Slower growth rates in South Australia, 6.3%, and NT, Australia's best kept secret, at 1.6%. So stepping a little bit further into what that Tasmania picture, and this is what I was talking about, a 9.3% growth in 2021 compared to only a 2.9% growth in 2016 and a 4% growth in 2011. And so if we look at this, I guess, in a longer kind of time frame of the history of Tasmania, you can see back to 1971, and the Tasmanian population was 370,000. So the Tasmanian population's only gone up by about 50% across 50 years compared to the Australian population, which has gone up 100% during that period of time. So Tasmania's usually been a slower growing population than most of the states and territories, which is what makes that 9.3% really noticeable in the last 5 years. It's actually the fastest growth between censuses we've seen in Tasmania since 1954, and they had 7 years between the 1947 and the 1954 census in order to beat that mark. So quite a notable kind of change in Tasmania. And if we zoom in a little bit closer, we can see an even more remarkable picture when we look at Greater Hobart, which has grown by about 11% since 2016, compared to about 8% across the balance of Tasmania. So very fast growth in the Hobart region in the last 5 years. This next picture shows a picture of population growth in the reddy orange colour and dwelling growth in the greeny, bluey, tealy colour next to each other there. And you can see here, notably in Tasmania, the orangey red line is standing over the teal line. So we've seen a population grow faster than the number of dwellings in Tasmania. So 9.3% population growth, only 7% dwelling growth. And as you can see there, that's probably the most notable difference where a population growth is higher than dwelling growth across Australia. In this presentation, because we're focusing on Tasmania, we can zoom in a little bit closer. And so a little bit about how Tasmania's population's distributed. We've divided Tasmania up here into what we call statistical area threes, which are just a way of trying to get areas of similar population size in order to compare, but also areas that we can keep the borders the same of from census to census. So you can show an actual fair comparison over time, whereas if you look at council boundaries or suburb boundaries or postcode boundaries, often they can change from census to census. In Tasmania as a whole, we're actually quite different to a lot of states and territories in that we're less capital city centric. There must be just so many beautiful places in Tasmania that not everyone needs to settle in Hobart. So Hobart has about 44% of the Tasmanian population in Hobart, 56% outside. Compare that to Victoria, it's about 75% in Melbourne, or South Australia and Western Australia, it's about 80% in the capital city of those territories, about 2/3 across the nation as a whole. So we're a lot more of a distributed population. Now, actually, what the slides here show us is on the left, the population change in percentages, and on the right, the dwelling change. And so you can sort of see quite consistently everywhere except for the West Coast has had population increases between 5 to 20% and over the last 5 years. On the dwelling growth picture, there's not near as much growth shown there. Just main growth in the area we call the southeast coast, which goes from Bicheno down to Orford, but also includes the Tasman Peninsula, and also out the Sorell, Dodgers Ferry and the Brighton kind of area. So where have we seen particularly big growth? Well, we've seen particularly big growth in the Sorell, Dodgers Ferry area. So this is the area which spans right from Richmond down to Dunalley, and it's saw the highest growth in population, about 15% since 2016. So there's now over 18,000 people all in that area. And this was followed by Brighton with a growth of just under 15%. And so nearly 20,000 people in the Brighton area. The Brighton SA3 actually includes Brighton, Bridgewater, Gagebrook, Otago. So quite a sort of a region around the eastern side of the river, up in the northern suburbs. But the Brighton area, zooming in a little bit there, it's got the youngest median age in Tasmania of only 35. And in that area, we counted over 5,000 families for the first time, so over 5,000 family households, and they make up over 75% of all occupied private dwellings in the area. So it's a real sort of family area. The other notable thing that we saw in that area was a very high proportion of one-parent families. So more than 1 in 4 families are a one-parent family, 26%, compared to 17% across Tasmania and 16% across Australia. We did notice a few other interesting things in terms of growth rates. For Central Highlands, declined in population through to 2016, but had a growth rate of 11% in the last 5 years. And Burnie, Ulverstone and the West Coast, whilst their population growth is a little bit slower, again, there was a decline in the previous 5 years, and a bigger growth in this 5 years is ahead of us. All right, that's enough from me at the moment. I'll hand over to Mark to talk to us a little bit more about the age structure of a Tasmanian population.
Thank you very much, Duncan, and good morning, everybody. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands we're all meeting on or dialed in from today. And for me here, I'm in Sydney, so not a local boy like Duncan is, but I'm in Sydney, and that's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. So we are now going to look at age. We'll talk more about dwellings and other things a bit later in the presentation, but for now we're still talking about people, and this is a classic population pyramid for Tasmania. This is showing 2001 for now. So what we're looking at here is on the left, you can see 5-year age cohorts for males going up to 85, and on the right, you can see the same for females. The bars represent the proportion of all males and females in each age cohort. So the largest group in 2001 in Tasmania for males was the 10 to 14 year age group, and very closely behind that, the 40 to 44 year old age groups, with just under 4% each of the male population of Tasmania. And the largest female age group in Tasmania in 2001 was the 40 to 44 years as well, also at 4%. And the median age at that time in 2001 was 36, which was slightly higher than the Australian median of 35. But what we can do now, because we're not necessarily here to look at the past, we're here to look at the present. And so we can overlay with that the 2021 data and have a look at how things have changed. So we can see here the most common age group now for males in Tasmania is a bit older at 25 to 29 years, and for females it's in the 60 to 64 year age groups. And there's been a number of changes to patterns over the last 20 years. We can see a bit of a reduction in the proportion of teenagers. We can see proportionately less people in their 40s and early 50s, and a real increase in that proportion for the 60 plus, particularly in females. We see that there. And the median age now has increased to 42 in Tasmania, which is quite a bit above the median age for Australia of 38. A few, Duncan, I think, mentioned Brighton, SA3 being the youngest with the median age of 35. Well, I'll call out the sort of South Coast area as having the oldest median age of 57. And in that area, we do see a number of families without children. So usually, the proportion of families without children is 44% for all of Tasmania, but it's 63% in that region. So that's definitely a contributing factor here to why we'd see a higher median age in that area. I will, I think, move us on now, but I do just want to give a quick word here about the non-binary sex variable. You'll notice that I've been talking about males and females over those slides, and we did have a sex question on the census form that allowed people to respond with a third option of non-binary sex. And we will be releasing information on the non-binary sex responses in an article in September. But for all our other data releases on the census, we're using a sex variable with male and female categories. So to be clear, we have certainly included all responses that we got on the census forms in our data, but where a respondent has provided a male or female response in combination with a non-binary sex response, we've assigned the male or female response that they gave us. And where there wasn't a male or female response given, but the person put non-binary sex, then for the purposes of our most of our outputs, we've put that imputed a random non-binary sex response. So our intention here is to minimise misinterpretations of census data. There's a number of caveats around how to use the non-binary sex data and how it should be interpreted, and so we're taking due consideration in releasing this information appropriately. And as I said, it will come out in September, and we've already got a conceptual article on our website explaining these processes and what we're doing more. So you can jump on and have a look at that if that's of interest to you. So I'm going to talk now about the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's data for Tasmania. And first up, we'll show, I guess, this cover slide showing the numbers over the last few censuses. So just over 30,000 people identified as being of Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander origin, which is about 5% of the population in the state. And that's an increase of 28.1% from the last census. And for Australia, we saw about a similar increase, about 25% in the number of people who identified as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander this census to the last. So showing this across the states, just to give a bit of context around that, large increases aren't unusual between censuses in this area. We've seen these sorts of increases in the number of people who identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander between censuses since 1971. And we do some further analysis on these increases once we have all the data that we need available, and some of that comes out in the second release of the census in October. And we get, we have a look at that and we try to understand what components are explainable through demographic factors like births and how much of it is due to different people identifying between from census to census. And we did that in 2016, and we will repeat that analysis this time. But if you compare here on the slide across states, you can see that New South Wales and Queensland continue to have the largest counts of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population people, and then there's about 7.5% of Australia's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population in the Northern Territory, but it actually makes up over 1/4 of the Northern Territory's population, which is quite different to the other states. So moving us on from there, I'm going to talk now about cultural diversity, and we're going to have a look at just how diverse is Tasmania. And this gives a nice overview, I guess, of the diversity at a very high level. But what we've categorised here are first generation, second generation, and third generation Australians, and that our third plus generation. And what we mean by that for a first generation is, was someone born in Australia or born overseas? So if they were born overseas and now living in Australia, they'd be considered a first generation Australian. If someone has at least one parent born overseas, then we've categorised that as a second generation Australian. And if someone has neither a parent, no, they were born in Australia and both their parents were born in Australia, then they would at least be a third generation, but they may go back much, much longer. In fact, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but potentially many years. And we've got everyone else essentially in this third plus generation. So what we can see here is that over 70%, or really just on 70% of the population have been in Australia for 3 generations or more in Tasmania, which is quite a bit higher than we've seen. It's more like 50% for Australia, and it's a lot higher than we see in other parts. So these proportions are significantly lower, as I said, and we'll get into, I guess, a bit more about what makes up the remainder, the 30% who were born either in other countries or their parents were born in other countries. And even in that third generation and plus, we see a lot of cultural diversity too, in terms of the ancestries that people put down. So Tasmania had as I said, a higher proportion of people born in Australia, and we can see that at the top there. But what about the countries outside of Australia where people were born? Well, we can see England is second on the list and has remained second on the list for the highest overseas country of birth for Tasmania, and that's similar to what we see for Australia as well. And that proportion there has stayed consistent since 2016. We saw an increase of about 500 people in that category. In the Greater Hobart region, just to compare a bit to what we see for that 79% that are born in Australia, in the Greater Hobart region, it's around 77% of the population born in Australia, and outside of Hobart, it actually climbs to over 81%. There are some changes to the list here. China replaced New Zealand in second place, and the Chinese-born population doubled to nearly 7,000 people in Tasmania, and almost half of this population is located in the sort of inner Hobart area, which saw a growth of over 1,000 Chinese-born people since 2016. And the east and southwest of Hobart also saw some large increases. And new to the top countries of birth list for Tasmania are those born in Nepal, which accounts for over 6,200 people in Tasmania, now making up just over 1% of the population. And that's a really significant increase for that population. It's more than 650% since 2016. It's about a third of this population that's located in the northwest of Hobart. And another fairly large mover is India. We saw a large increase right across Australia of the Indian-born population, and it's also true in the Tasmania area. It's entered the top 5 of countries of birth for Tasmania, and we've seen an increase of just under 5,000 people since 2016. So looking at that on the map, we can see that most of these SA3, these statistical area 3 regions in Tasmania have less than the 13%, 0 to 13% of usual residents born overseas, and the exceptions there are in Hobart with 29% born overseas. Launceston had 16% born overseas, about 3% from England, and just under 2% from Nepal. And Greater Hobart has a considerably higher proportion of people born in China, as I said, compared to the rest of Tasmania. That's 2.2% in China, and it's continued to grow since 2011, when it was only around 0.7% of the population. So we have seen that continue to grow, but outside of Hobart, for the rest of Tas, it's a very small number, and it's grown very little since 2011. And England does remain that top country of birth outside of Australia in both Greater Hobart and the rest of Tas, as I said earlier. So year of arrival is a really interesting view of the data given COVID, and we've color-coded this. You'll be able to see from the green, which shows pre-COVID, and then that sort of angry orangey red for when COVID came upon us. So we still did see over 1 million people migrating to Australia in the last 5 years. That's all of Australia, but there's that clear COVID impact in 2020, and that's a very different spread of when those arrivals came across the year. And so here we're presenting the numbers of people who are migrated to Australia over the past 5 years and then settled in Tasmania. And you can clearly see that increase up until 2019. Well, it was slightly less per year, but large numbers up until 2019, and then the steep drop off in 2020. 2021 only represents the calendar year until census night on the 10th of August, so it's not the full calendar year. However, it's still well down and only 378 people, so a very obvious effect there. And it was all up for all the people who came into Australia and lived in Tasmania in 2020 and 2021. It's only about 1.2% who settled in Tasmania. So all those who came into Australia and settled in Tasmania is about 1.2% of that full number. And that's that pattern, though, that we see where a lot of people and then the steep drop off is obviously very similar to what we saw across the country. So let's have a quick look at the languages other than English spoken at home. And looking at these languages, we can see clear migration trends reflected in this data, with a move from 30 years ago in 1991, more European languages spoken at home, to the more Asian languages in the top 5 that are reflected today in the 2021 census. Mandarin at the top there in 2021, followed by Nepali, which is no surprise based on what I've been talking about already in terms of the growth of the Chinese-born people in Hobart, as well as that strong growth in people from Nepal. So Mandarin has remained as the top language spoken at home other than English over the past 3 censuses, and we also see Cantonese there in the top 5. And there were 7,248 Nepali speakers in Tasmania. And so it also featured in the top 5 languages for the ACT this census, where there was also a strong growth. But not only have the top languages changed here, so the more Asian influence than the European, but the proportion of people speaking other languages at home has also increased, which isn't what we see for the rest of Australia, where those proportions of languages have changed quite a lot, but the proportions have stayed quite similar. But we can see more people speaking other languages than English at home. It's only small increases at the top there, but they are still going up in terms of those numbers. Now, one very interesting story that a lot of people are always interested in the census, and it's certainly interesting in Tasmania, is religion. So this slide shows the religion trend, I guess, for Australia, and it's a question that we've had on the form on all Australian censuses since 1911. And answering this question's always been optional, but we still see well over 90% of people respond to this question, and even more chose to respond to it in 2021 than did in 2016. So you can see at the Australia level this decrease in people reporting an affiliation with a Christian religion over the past 50 years presented here. It's now at about 44% of the population of Australia, and that increase in people reporting no religion, that's the green line there, and the Christian religions grouped together is the orange line. So the no religion line there has been increasing and is now at about 38% for Australia, and looks very much like they will cross over in the next 5 years. But how does that look for Tasmania? Slightly different, and we have broken up the Christian religion all grouped together here into Anglican, Catholic, and then the other Christian denominations. So you do get a bit more of a picture there. But if we were to group all of those together, it would come in just under 40%. So if you were comparing it to the previous graph, you'd see that those Christian denominations grouped together would be just under 40%. Whereas looking at this data for Tasmania, you can see that really clear growth in people reporting no religious affiliation, that green line, and it's almost exactly 50% now, much higher than we saw for the 38% or so that we saw for Australia. And so, that continued decrease in the proportion that we've seen in those Christian denominations. So Anglican there is the yellow line, and it's still the Christian denomination with the highest proportion at about 14%. Catholic's the red line, it's just a bit lower in 2021 at 13%. And in Hobart, both Anglican and Catholic, just out of interest, had about an equal proportion of the population, both coming in at 14.1% each, and that's about 35,000 people reporting each of these. In fact, it was just 50 more people in Hobart who responded as Anglican than Catholic, so still slightly higher, but an equal percentage share, at least at one decimal place. So the lines at the bottom here are very hard to distinguish because they are small numbers, but they represent that Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism. So, and they have seen slight increases to now be Hinduism being 1.7% of the population, Buddhism is 1%, and Islam is at 0.9%. So just a few interesting things to note. In the northwest of Hobart, Hinduism more than tripled since 2016 to over 3,000 people. More than a third of those whose religious affiliation is Hinduism in Tasmania live in this area. And this area had a significant increase, as we've talked about, in both Nepalese and Indian-born people. And of those born in Nepal, more than 80% stated Hinduism as their religious affiliation. From those born in India, it was about 45%. So clearly an impact there, and why we're seeing those growths. I am going to hand back to Duncan now to take us through a bit about long-term health conditions and some new information on the census. Thanks, Duncan.
Thanks, Mark. So yeah, it's my great pleasure to talk about long-term health conditions. These is one of the two new topics we had on the census in 2021. We hadn't added a new topic to the census since 2006, so you could imagine the office parties we had at the ABS had the opportunity to ask a new question and get some new insights in the census. I think the understanding health conditions in Australia is pretty obvious as why it's important, and it's certainly a big part of our public expenditure, but it's also a big part of our well-being and our happiness as people. And so this is a question which was asked on a census form. Have you been told by a doctor or nurse that you have one of these long-term health conditions? And was 10 health conditions that you could tick a box for, or you could indicate that you've got a different long-term health condition, or you could indicate that you've got none of the above. So we came up with this list of 10 health conditions by consulting with health authorities, health departments, policy areas, to try and understand conditions where there is a significant enough part of a population that it's valuable to collect data in the census, but also that there was a real information need, and that information could then help with policy work and policy research. Before I jump into what the data actually shows you here, the ABS collects a lot of different information on health. We run really comprehensive, detailed health surveys, which will get right into the detail of different components of mental health, or different details of people's health, including biomedical samples and analysis of heart rate and different conditions. Now, that data is just amazing if you want to understand the depths of a particular condition, really understand the details of that, and look at things at a national level or a state level. The limitations, though, of our surveys are that we just can't go to enough people to give us really accurate data at a small area level, or for small population groups, or for small age groups. And that's where the census really comes into its own. So we encourage you to use the census in combination with those other surveys. Use the other surveys to get that deeper dive into a particular condition. Use the census to then dive into particular areas of the population. Enough preamble though. So what did we see in terms of health conditions? So we actually saw, or quite remarkably, a little bit over 1/3 of all Tasmanians have reported having one of a selected long-term health condition. So one of those 10, not even counting the people who ticked other. And this is nearly 6 percentage points higher than the national average. So very, very high in Tasmania. Some of this is, would be linked to the fact that Tasmania does have an older population than other states and territories. And as I'll show you in a second, there is a relationship between some of the conditions and age, but that doesn't explain all of the difference. But we do see sort of higher rates in South Australia, the second oldest state in Australia as well as higher levels of people reporting a need for assistance in the census. What you can also see here is that out of the third of people in Tasmania who report a long-term health condition, about 2/3 of those, 121,000, reported only having one long-term health condition, whereas 43,000 reported having 2 health conditions, and 23,000 reported having 3 or more health conditions. Where this becomes really important to look at is we published data on who reported conditions which have defined comorbidities. So people who had asthma and lung condition, or diabetes and heart disease. And so that's where this information of people having more than one health condition really comes to play. So like a lot of things in the census, looking at the analysis of the data by age group is a really valuable way of exploring the data. And so we've just got 5 of the 10 long-term health conditions showcased on this slide. Otherwise, it becomes a bit of a confusing rainbow of colours if we'd put all 10 in lines on the graph. So looking at these 5, let's have a look at a few of them individually. So the big, I guess, orange line, which sort of emerges like the Loch Ness Monster there halfway along, that's the arthritis line. And what you can see there is that there's a really strong relationship between age and likelihood to have arthritis. And so what this is showing us is that over 40% of people who are 80 years and over have arthritis. It drops to about 35% of people 70 to 79 and lower as you go into the younger age groups. And so overall, the proportion, the percentage of Tasmanians reporting arthritis is about 4 percentage points higher than the national average, so 12% compared to 8%. So that's the one which most significantly stands out and is clearly sort of an age-related kind of condition. Two others which you can see sort of age patterns with diabetes in the light blue and heart disease in the light orange. And as you can see there, they don't affect as high a proportion of response population as arthritis, but do definitely grow with age, grow significance with age. Now, a couple of the conditions which don't follow the same age kind of pattern are asthma. So asthma is the yellow line, and lots of people think of asthma as just something that kids have with their puffers, but actually you can see that yellow line is pretty consistent across all age groups. And so it continues to be a reported condition across every age group of the population, from young age right through to older years. Then the final one we'll highlight today is mental health in the teal. So it definitely stands out as being a little bit of a different pattern. It's the highest reported condition for all age groups from 20 through to 50. And what we see in Tasmania, sadly, is that the rates in the younger age groups are higher than the national average, between 3 to 6 percentage points higher than the national average. Whereas into older age, it's more closely aligned with the national kind of picture. The next picture goes in, just looks at mental health by statistical area 3, and the darker colours here represent areas of higher reported mental health condition. So the rates are at least 9% in all SA3s across Tasmania, but yeah, where we can see it higher, it is in the Brighton area, so Brighton, Gagebrook, Bridgewater, Otago, where it's 13%. Hobart Northwest, which is from my stamping ground growing up, north of the Feta Line, from Moona right through to New Norfolk, it's about 12.8% in that kind of region. And so, and as well as an area up towards on the northwest coast around sort of Devonport or Ulverston region of Tasmania with higher reported areas. The other new question we asked in the census was service in the Australian Defence Force. So service in the Australian Defence Force, we asked a question on military service in 1947, but this is the first time we've got a comprehensive picture of not just currently serving Defence Force people, but former servicing Defence Force people and people in the regular services, as well as the reserve services in Australia. Really important, particularly for our former service people in Australia, to make sure that we understand where they live, how their characteristics are changing and how they might be different to a regular population, to make sure that we as a country are providing the right support services through organisations like the Veterans, DVA, Defence Veterans of Australia. So about 4% of the Tasmanian population have either currently served or previously served in the Australian Defence Force. A vast majority of these are previously served, 3.8%. This is the highest of all states and second only to Northern Territory in terms of jurisdictions. Yet, interestingly, at SA3 level, Launceston is the highest SA3 for currently serving with 138 people, as well as 2,400 previously serving men and women. And this is closely followed by a couple of the areas in Hobart, and in total, a Hobart Greater City has 570 people currently serving and 7,500 who have previously served in the Defence Force. Where this data is going to be really valuable is for organisations like Defence Veterans, DVA, who currently provide services to only a little bit more than half of former service population in Australia. So they're really be pleased to have got this data now to really understand, I guess, the missing half of the former service people in Australia, and understand and whether or not there is a gap there in terms of services that we provide as a nation. Okay, stepping further forward, let's have a little bit look at, we've already heard a little bit about population and then a lot about our people. Let's talk about how our people will live and how we group together in terms of our households. And in Census, we group together classify our households as 3 different kinds of households. Firstly, there's family households. So this is where people are living together and are related to each other. Then there are lone person households. So these are households of one, and then group households, which are more than one person living together who aren't related. So Tassie has the highest proportion of lone person households in Australia at 29% and higher than the 25.6% across Australia, and accordingly a little bit lower proportion of family households in Australia. But I mentioned earlier Brighton, our youngest population. So in our Brighton area, it's actually about 3/4 of households are family households compared to 2/3 across the state. So quite a bit of difference from area to area. Other areas which are well above the state average for family households are Hobart, the south and west side of Hobart. So it's down Hobart through Kingston, Margate, down Hugh and Bruny Island Way, out Sorell and Dodgers Ferry, in Meander Valley, West Tamar, up north, and through the Central Highlands as well. There's more family households than the state average. Hasn't been a significant change in what we've seen in terms of a composition of family households since 2016. But if we look back to 1996, you can see sort of a bigger change. So you can see sort of the longer trend. So lone person households have increased by almost 5%. Family households have decreased by about 4%. So these kind of family trends tend to change sort of slower over a longer period of time. But let's have a little bit of a closer look at family households. So this, as I said, is our dominant structure in households. So 150,000 families were counted in Tasmania. But what Tasmania does have is now the lowest proportion of couples with children of all states and territories, and the highest proportion of couples without children. So about 44.5% of families are couple families, so just a couple or without children at home. And so this is a combination of some couples that haven't had children, but in the Tasmanian context, a larger share of them are couples where the children have moved out of home, but they're now our empty nesters. And so Mark did highlight earlier some of the areas which stand out for age. And if we look at East Coast, so Bicheno, Orford, Tasman Peninsula, you've got 1 in 3 households are lone person households. 2 in 5 households are couples without children. So it means that right through that SA3, only 1 in 5 homes now have children there in that region. One area of families is which we do and have seen more dramatic change since the census, the number of married and de facto same-sex couples counted in the census. So the census doesn't ask about sexual orientation, and it just asks about relationships within the household. So for all of our couple statistics, it only picks up couples that are living together, cohabitating. And so the count here of same-sex couples is only the count of same-sex couples which are cohabitating. Now this current chart shows that the count of both married and de facto same-sex couples in each state and territory. And largely that shape, it's not surprising to see bigger states like New South Wales and Victoria with the higher stacks there, and Tasmania being a lower stack because of its lower relative population. This is sort of showing counts. What is interesting for us when we look at this data is seeing that the registered marriages counted in the census for the first time. The marriage law changed in 2017, as you might remember. So this is the first census where we've counted registered marriages of same-sex couples in the census. And about 1/3 of the same-sex couples in Tasmania were in a registered marriage, a little bit higher than the national average, which might be to do with COVID restrictions, which are a little bit stronger in some states. And so people may have deferred marriages, weddings, things during that period of time. And this one is the one which really sort of stood out when we were looking at this data. This is the growth in same-sex couples in Tasmania. As you can see here on the right-hand side, in 2021, there was 1,681 couples, same-sex couples, counted in Tasmania. This has increased by 99%, so basically doubled since 2016. And that followed a 40% increase since 2011. And so the number of same-sex couples in Tasmania have grown significantly, and they've actually grown faster than the national rate over the last 5 years, is where it grew by around 70%. All right, enough about me and families. Let's hand back to Mark to hear a little bit about dwellings.
Thank you, Duncan. Yes, we'll move on to dwellings now and get straight into it. So first up, tenure type, and we can see Tasmania had 37% of dwellings owned outright, and that compares to 31% for Australia. So quite a high proportion of dwellings owned outright. And then conversely, we see lower proportions of rented dwellings and those owned with a mortgage. So 33% owned with a mortgage, and that compares to 36% nationally and 26% rented, comparing to about 30%, 31% nationally. Greater Hobart, that Greater Hobart area has 34% of dwellings owned outright, and then it's much higher for the rest of Tas at around 40%. And the owned with a mortgage in Greater Hobart is around 34.5%, and then rented is at about 29%. So there are some differences there. If we look at dwelling tenure over time, so having a look at how these have changed across censuses, we can see the number of private dwellings for the last 25 years, where those who owned with a mortgage and those that are renting have increased, reflecting the national trend. But in Tas, in the 20 years between 1996 and 2016, the number of dwellings owned outright dropped slightly from 74,000 to 71,000, but then increased again to 2021 to about 82,000, which is interesting. And then the most noticeable increase was for those who owned with a mortgage, which has grown from 47,000 to over 72,000, which is an increase of over 50%. Unoccupied dwellings, also something of interest, and I just want to be clear, because we have seen a lot of interest in the unoccupied dwelling counts on the census, but it's very important to understand what we're talking about when we talk about unoccupied dwellings in the census. It really means a dwelling for which nobody was home on census night. What it doesn't mean is that it's necessarily a long-term vacant dwelling. So that's important to understand. And it can include something that's unoccupied on census night, could include a dwelling where someone has gone to hospital for a period or was away for some other reason. But it can also include holiday homes. It can include that weren't being used in that sort of the middle of winter when we take the census. It can include newly completed dwellings that people haven't moved in, or ones that are being renovated, where people have chosen to live elsewhere for that period while it's being renovated. It can include habitable dwellings that are to be demolished, and it can also include dwellings to let that are just between people, between tenants, essentially. So there was almost 30,000 unoccupied private dwellings in Tasmania on census night that we recorded in the census last year, and that unoccupied by the definition that I was just talking about. And that's represented about just over 11% of all private dwellings in Tassie. And that's a rate that's a little higher than what we saw for Australia, which was about 10%, just under 10%. But lower than the rate on census night in 2016 for Tassie, which was over 13%. So if we look at that across the different SA3, Statistical Area 3 regions, you can see that the distribution of those unoccupied dwellings isn't even across the state. And across Greater Hobart area, we're sort of seeing mostly around 5%, but there are some that are closer to moving up to 10% sort of proportions, whereas outside of the Hobart area, the proportion's generally higher, and that includes 50% on the east coast. So that area, the east coast, goes from Bisheno. I hope I'm probably not saying these right, down to Orford, and I'm not from the area. I apologise, but we'll get Duncan on here to correct me soon. And it includes the Tasman Peninsula. There's lots of holiday homes, as many would know, or shacks and Airbnbs, and it's much more highly populated in summer than it would be in August when we take the census. The Central Highlands area there, that includes the lakes area, where again, many people have shacks for fishing and other water activities. And actually the Central Highlands local government area, which is a part of that Central Highlands SA3, had, if we look at that, it was about 60% unoccupied. So as Duncan covered earlier, right near the start of the data in this presentation, population growth exceeded the dwelling growth substantially over the last 5 years for Tasmania. And so it's interesting to see how low the unoccupied numbers are across Hobart. So in 2016, we could see that sort of the south and west areas of Hobart were around 8.2% unoccupied, and that's now 5%. Brighton SA3, that includes a few areas around Brighton that Duncan referred to earlier. It was 6% in 2016, now at 4%. So these overall, what we're seeing in across Hobart are very low numbers compared to what we see in many areas around Australia. And similarly, we can see in Launceston there, 7%, which is quite low, but it's down quite a bit from 2016 when it was at 10%. So some interesting unoccupied dwellings data. And we'll also have a look at dwelling structure. So a bit of a comparison 20 years ago to now, very similar shapes, but there are some differences in the percentages. The majority of Tasmanians continue to live in separate houses, which is very much true 20 years ago and now, but it has increased just slightly up about 1.5 percentage points. And that equates to around 40,000 houses, totaling over 190,000. That increase is about 40,000 private houses, totaling about 190,000 in 2021. And semi-detached and townhouses also grew, but only by about 0.7, I think it's 0.7 percentage points, or around 3,000 dwellings. So just one final data slide and a quick look at income and housing costs. There's been an increase in both the median weekly household income and personal income over the last 5 years. If we were to compare the rate of inflation over that time, it comes in at just almost 10%, about 9%. So this is showing higher increases, much higher increases than the rate of inflation. Rent has also increased. However, mortgage repayments have remained almost stable. It's important to note that with the census, we do look at what people are paying. They report what they're paying on their mortgage. It's not necessarily the minimum required payment. People can pay more than they need to, and may have been doing that in 2016. And obviously mortgages are in place for a long time and can be set. So depending on how many new people are coming in to the market, it can affect what sort of payments that we see reported on the census. Greater Hobart, just to break it down a little more, has median monthly mortgage repayments of just over $1,500, so around $240 more than what we see across the rest of Tas, and that's what's on screen is the result for the whole of Tasmania, and that's similar to Greater Hobart's median weekly rent repayment, which is about $100 more than the rest of Tas. However, both Greater Hobart and the rest of Tas, when we look at these overall Tasmania results for both rent and mortgage repayments, are still lower than what we see for the overall Australia results. So before we get to questions, which we will do very soon, and hopefully some questions have been coming in to put Duncan to the test in his home state, and me too, I suppose. I'll just have a quick chat about what's next and how to access census information so that everyone can get in and play themselves if they're not doing so already. So first up, a quick reminder, what we've been covering today are the topics listed under first release that came out on the 28th of June. And you can see those there, but we do have another really interesting release coming up, and we've now locked in the date of the 12th of October this year. That comes out with a whole lot of information that will really shed light on COVID, in a number of COVID stories. So labour force, we've got our non-school qualifications, method of travel to work, workplace address, and internal migration. So there should be some really interesting stories there, and get to see where some of that growth in Tasmania has come from in terms of who's been moving in the last year and in the last 5 years, and where they've come from around Australia or overseas. And then later in early to mid 2023, we released some of our more complex analytical products, including our socioeconomic indexes for areas, CEFA, our estimates of homelessness and that remoteness areas, as well as that Australian Census longitudinal data set. So those are the things that are coming up. But when you want to get in and access census data right now, and to get in and see those products as they become available, just go to our website. It is extremely easy to access census data. So I really encourage you to just dip your toe in the water and come and have a look. Don't be too intimidated if you've been to the ABS website in the past. Sometimes people get scared off revisiting. But if you come right on the front page of the ABS website, you can link to census at the top. And then when you come into here, you can hit find census data, and it's really easy to search for an area or a topic of interest. You can choose between, do I want to look via a map or type in an area, and it'll bring up all the options for that, whether it's the statistical areas we've been talking about, a local suburb, a local government area. You can look it up, or obviously states in Australia. You can look up and see a whole range of information, lots of which we've been presenting today, but a whole lot more for that area, and we call that our Quick Stats product. Or you can download a spreadsheet that'll give the whole community profile. There's also Indigenous profiles and a range of other things available. Or you can look at the articles that we've already written and have some spreadsheets and data behind those as well that you can download and check out if you're interested in a particular topic and you want to deep dive a bit more into that topic. Things like cultural diversity, health and housing available in the data by topic, and will be becoming available. We haven't released all of our articles yet. We're continuing to release them, but more and more are becoming available. One just quick note is that many of you would be aware that we haven't yet released 2021 census data into Table Builder. We know how valuable that product is. We know how much people are looking forward to working with that, and we are very much working on that as a priority. We want to meet that demand as soon as possible. So we will release it as soon as we can. We're not quite there yet and ready to announce the date, but we will definitely be doing that as soon as we can. And we are providing updates on the website. So please stay tuned to that, and we'll let people know as soon as we have more information. If you have any questions about census data or the topics that you're looking at, the definitions you really want to get into and understand what's behind it, question snippets, anything else to really, the history and how it should be used, how it was created, all of those things, and also glossaries and variables, and that our census dictionary is a real one-stop shop to help yourself on those areas. You can link in very easily and navigate around that to really understand all the ins and outs of how we asked the census and what each of those variables means and how it was generated. So that is certainly something you should check out if you do get into looking at the census data. But enough about all of what we want to present. We'd really like to hear from you now and answer some of your questions. And Duncan will be coming back onto the screen, I'm sure, as well as Lauren, who our Strategic Partnership Manager for Tasmania, who will be facilitating the Q&A. So thank you, Lauren. And the Poll EV is right there on the screen. If you haven't done it already, then log into that website at pollev.com and put in that 2021 Census DS TAS, and you'll be able to ask your questions on that, and we'll answer them now if we can get to them all. Thanks, Lauren.
Lovely, thank you. And just while everybody takes a moment to put their questions in, I'd also like to pay my respects to the Palawa Pakana people as the traditional custodians of Lutruwita, Tasmania, this beautiful island that I'm privileged to call home. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Thank you. We do have some questions already flowing in, but I thought I might start with a quick one for you, Mark, just related to that extra information that's coming out. I've got a couple of questions around Journey to Work and when that's going to be available, and a question also around whether we saw more people working from home in the Census 21 data. Can I get you to give us a little bit more of an update on when that type of information might be available?
Absolutely, yes. The Journey to Work data is coming out in the second release on the 12th of October. So I can't yet talk about what that data shows. In fact, I'm not as heavily across it. I've looked at some early stuff, but we're finalising that data now and getting it into all our products. And then we'll have a good long look at that, and very, very interested to see what it says and how COVID may have affected that across the country with people in lockdown. But not until the 12th of October. That's when we'll be releasing that data.
Fantastic, thank you. All right, let's go right back to the start then. Duncan, right at the start, we spoke about the proportion of people who were responding via paper and responding online. One of the questions that's come in is why is the paper response rate so high in Tasmania? I was wondering if you could give us a bit of insight into that. Thanks.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So just to remind everyone, we saw the Tassie online response rate jump from 45% to just over 60%, whereas we saw the national level climb up from 60% up to about 80%. So there was already a bit of a difference, and that difference has stayed as we've gone forward. We think there's a few factors at play here for Tasmania. Some of it is demographically. Having an older population and does mean that a few more people might be more comfortable or more used to filling out a paper form. A lot of people living alone, lone person households in Tasmania. So if there's a family living together, as long as one person knows how to do it online, they might be able to complete it for everyone in the household, whereas one person there in the household. But there are also impacts on this which are caused a bit by the way that we undertake for census in Australia. So we do, in parts of a population where we feel that there's a likelihood to use paper or it's going to take more time to mail out paper forms and mail them back. We provide a paper form up front, and we actually do that more in Tasmania than any other state and territory. And what we see is that if we give people an option of paper up front, we will see a higher proportion of the paper forms come back to us. And I think that's something which is really important for us to think about for 2026 is how do we get that balance right? We want to make it easy for people to participate, make paper available where it's needed, and that'll always be an option for people, but make sure that we don't undersell Tasmanians and their ability to be able to complete online, because ultimately the digital responses are better for the country. They're a little bit cheaper, they save some paper, and they end up with a slightly higher quality data than the paper responses. So we'll look at our approaches there for next time. But yeah, so some of it's driven by the population and some of it's driven by the methods we use in terms of providing more paper out to households in Tasmania.
Lovely, thank you, Duncan. I should have probably said as well, we're going to apologise to Mark for throwing some of those tricky to pronounce place names at him, and I'm going to throw another, local term up in this question. Mark, could you just tell us, in the data for 2021, are we still seeing lots of people leaving Tasmania for the mainland for work?
So again, I wish we had that data right now. So we have seen what we've been able to talk about is where people are usually residing at the right now, and what we will be able to see in the second release is census data that asks the question, where were you living 5 years ago? Where were you living 1 year ago? And then we can actually map the internal migration of people who have left from Tasmania to the mainland or vice versa, and be able to see that. But again, that's something that comes out a bit later in our second release, and not something that we have available right now. So I'm answering interesting questions with a really boring response, but it's all I can say at this point.
That's fine. And I think the next question probably is going to have the same response, which is how has tourism changes shown up in the data? Is that something that we can expect to look at further in the second release as well?
Certainly around occupation and the different jobs and that they're involved in tourism, we would see that in second release. We do have place of enumeration data, which is another way you can look at the data. So we have, to explain what that means, we do count people where they are on census night and ask people to fill it out where they are and for where they are. We also ask them then to tell us where they usually live, and all of the data that we present in our standard, most of the data I should say that we present in our standard products is by that where people usually live, because that's important for service provisions and understanding local populations and things like that. But you can look at the data by where people were counted, and that would give you some understanding of how many people were visiting and that at the time, but more rich information will come out in the second release.
Lovely, thank you. Might give Mark a second to turn his lights back on and throw a question at Duncan. One of the comments have come here is a note that there are more couples with no children in Tasmania, and the question then is, can the population increase in 2021 be attributed to people moving to Tassie? And perhaps maybe a little bit of a comment on what is driving that growth in population change between 2016 and 2021 censuses.
Thanks, Lauren. Obviously, there's part of this answer. It would be Mark's response to a previous couple of questions. Internal migration will provide a bit of a richer picture of both how many people are moving from interstate, but also what are the characteristics of those people that are moving in. But some of the things that we can already see in first release were the numbers that Mark put up before around the overseas arrivals to Tasmania since 2016. So those numbers, just to bring those back to your attention, and it highlighted nearly 20,000 people who are born overseas have arrived in Australia and are now usually resident in Tasmania since the start of 2016. So 20,000 in a population of 500,000, that's about a 4% alone owned for those arriving from overseas. So that's out of our 9.3% growth. That tells you part of a picture and part of a story. Obviously, you can also see in our data that there's a lot of 0 to 4 year olds in the count, and so they've obviously been born since the last census. So they're a bit of a contributor as well to the population picture. But the other flows that you can see, and the couples with no children, and that can also be where children are now grown up and have moved out of home, and they might be occupying a different home now. They might be in a group household with friends, they might be living alone, or they might be in another couple household, and their parents are now empty nesters, a couple family with no children and occupying a household. And so that's another way where without an increase in population, we can end up with an increasing number of households which are occupied because there's less people per household. And one of the long-running trends we've seen, and I don't have the Tasmanian numbers to hand here, has been a reduction in the number of people per household, or usually resident in Australia. So that adds a little bit more to the picture. So these things, it's always a combination of factors: international migration and understanding the births, understanding the internal migration, and then understanding the number of people per home. Add all of those factors together and it'll all add up.
Lovely, thank you. Well, while we're on that topic, there are a couple of questions that are kind of related to international migration. And one question that I'll start with around estimated resident population stats and the relationship between census and ERP. So the question is that the ERP figures seem to have been adjusted with the release of the 2021 census. And can you please provide a bit more of an explanation about those ERP adjustments, Duncan?
Yeah, absolutely. So the question asker is completely right. The population estimate for Tasmania has been bumped up a little bit after the running of this census. And so what we do in broad terms is that every 5 years since 1961, we've conducted a full census of population and housing. We then get a measure for how much we think the census has undercounted or overcounted the population. And so we use that to adjust for census. So usually the census has an undercount. So you add on a percentage or 2% based on the people we've worked out we've missed on the census. And then the estimates of resident population are always, they're not released for census night, they're released for the end of June, end of December, so end of September, so every 3 months. So we need to adjust for census to that date by adding back in Australians which are temporarily overseas, adding in births, taking away deaths, and adjusting for internal movement between states. And then in between censuses, we maintain an estimate of resident population by using government records that we have of births, deaths, international migration, and trying to understand internal migration through people updating things like their Medicare address. And so it does a very good job of producing an estimated population every 3 months or so, and throughout the period in between censuses. But what we see when we do the census is that's a chance for us to true up and reconcile. Have those records that we're getting from government, have they correctly reflected all of the moves and changes in the population? And so what we saw in Tasmania when we did that true up was that we had missed some of the internal migration in Australia over the last 5 years. And so there was a few more people that ended up in Tasmania than what our models and our estimates had shown. And so that's why we adjusted that population up, and that's given us now a more accurate population estimate that we'll try and maintain from this point going forward. It's obviously been a really difficult 5 years, or a very unusual 5 years for understanding the population and population movements, with the impacts of COVID-19 amongst other things in that kind of mix. So hopefully that gives a little bit more of a picture, but certainly it meant that for a period there, the official numbers for Tasmania were showing less population than what there actually was.
Lovely, thank you. Mark, just again, while we're still on that topic of international migration, one of our questions here relates to the increase in the proportion of people who have been born in Nepal. And the question notes that that's actually an across Australia trend. If there's any thoughts as to what's going on in that space?
So definitely we have seen large numbers come in, but we can see that there is relatively large settlement in Tasmania and in the ACT for those populations or communities, if you will. Exactly what is driving that, there's a number of factors. I don't have particular information on why people are coming from Nepal and moving to Tasmania and to the ACT, but I think the movements that we're seeing from those countries are interesting, and they're not the only ones, but they did start from Nepal. In terms of Nepal, it started from a very small number. So seeing that the numbers that have come in over the last 5 years is interesting and makes a huge proportionate increase compared to, say, the Indian-born and Chinese-born people who come in and have come in still in quite a large number, but don't make anywhere near as big a proportional increase. I'm not sure if I've answered the question well. I don't have inside information on why, but Duncan, I don't know if you can shed any other light on that either, but I'm not aware of why people from Nepal have gone to Tasmania particularly.
Not about the Nepalese in particular, but in general, one of the factors at play has been in different migration and rules and laws in Australia, and the fact that there's been certain requirements around where people could settle upon arrival under different visa categories, and that certainly has we've seen a correlation between those changes coming in and an increase in international arrivals in Tasmania. And with that, I guess the current and wave of migration has included a number of migrants from Nepal, and so they've ended up in a few of those what's classified in the scheme as more regional centres of Australia. So Hobart's classified as a more regional centre, Tasmania. And I don't think it's attractive for Nepalese to Hobart, but it's and now a nice feature of Hobart is the first Nepali pub in Australia. So Choke, the first Nepalese pub in Australia, is here in Hobart. So maybe that'll attract even more Nepalese in the future.
Lovely, lovely. We do have a little bit of time left. There are still some questions to get through, but we might change tack just a little bit. Mark, I'm going to send this question your way. I was just wondering, the question come in, can you make any comments on the growth of people identifying as Aboriginal in Tasmania when compared to the 2016 data?
So really, the comments I can make are the ones that I already sort of made in the presentation, which is we will analyse that further to understand the components of that growth, including the demographic factors, natural increases in that, as well as understanding who is identifying for the first time. Is there a cohort, a different cohort identifying in this census to the past census? And that those sorts of increases are, what we've seen between censuses over the last 50 years or so. So it's not unusual in that respect. The census is a self-reported and reported on behalf of the household. So that's the way that we collect information on the census. And so these are the results we have. And when we have all the information together, including the second release information, we're able to do some more analysis on that.
Cheers. Thanks, Mark. All right. And then one of the other common themes that's coming through in the question relates to our new questions. So, Duncan, maybe back to you, since you gave us the information around the new long-term health conditions. The question that I have here is, how will the data on long-term illnesses inform the medical services available or improvements in services? And thank you, was in the question.
Great question. And for one of the things that I often reflect on when I think about the long-term health conditions question is that I think we're really just scraping the absolute surface of understanding what that data can inform us on and tell us at the moment, and how that data can be used from a research perspective as well as from a service delivery perspective. Most areas of a census, as I mentioned, at a minimum have been on now our 4 or 5 censuses. A number of questions have been on every one of our 18 censuses in Australia. So it's and what happens over time is that we really start seeing census data get embedded into our systems of public administration in Australia, into models that design how we consider priorities for funding distribution, for service development. And so I'm not sure exactly how the long-term health conditions data is going to get used. And that's one of the really exciting things for us is that we listen to the public and to government and the public administration around what is a data need, what is an information gap, what is something that a census can help fill. And we heard really strongly that long-term health conditions was one of those. We're really proud to have filled that gap. And now we're looking forward to seeing how that data is used from this point going forward. I think that there will be cases we'll see in the next few years where it comes out from a service delivery point of view, but also cases from a research point of view. Just one particular anecdote that I'll share is that we have done quite a bit of work with the Royal Flying Doctors Service in Australia, and they actually came along and co-presented at one of these seminars with us a month or so ago, and they talked about how valuable they'll use this data for designing things like where do they have services set up, where do they need to employ staff, what are the equipment they need to have in place in different areas to service a population. And so that's a really tangible kind of thing. Royal Flying Doctors Service do a really important service in Tasmania as well as in more remote parts of mainland Australia.
Lovely. Thank you very much. I understand that there is a health seminar if people would like to learn more about the health-related questions on the census coming up.
absolutely. Late August, I think. So we've got we'll be releasing an analytical article. So we release articles where we dive in a little bit more into the data and bring out some more insights. So we'll be releasing an article late this month, and we'll have a national seminar as well, just like this one, free to join in, where we'll get into a bit more detail on that particular question.
Lovely. And then I think we might make this next question our last one and give everybody a couple of minutes back in their day. And I have saved it to the last, is looking forward then, are there likely to be new questions in the next census? I might hand it over to both of you to wrap it up with that question. Thanks.
Well, I can go first. We do have a consultation process that will kick off. I believe it's going to kick off in terms of public consultation next year, early next year, but I could be wrong, and Duncan will correct me if I am. But that's something that we do between censuses, where we go out and ask the public and a whole lot of stakeholders, is there any content that you'd like to see on the census form? Now, there are some caveats around that in terms of something needs to be nationally of interest and use. It needs to be appropriate to be asked through the methodology that we use on the census, i.e. A household filling it out on behalf of the others in that family, filling it out on behalf of the family, that sort of thing. We do need to consider the cost of every question on the census form, and real estate is it's about as expensive as real estate gets to get that much space on a census form, and just in terms of people's understanding, and are people able to interpret those questions across cultures, across all of the different areas that we have across Australia. So it needs to be not just nationally useful, but nationally appropriate to ask the question and get a consistent response. So those are some of the things. There's probably others that I haven't mentioned, but we will go forward and be asking people to submit to that process, and then eventually we go through a government process where we make recommendations to the government, to Parliament, to and it's ultimately a government decision to what topics will appear on the next census. So that happens much closer to 2026. Duncan, anything to add to that?
Great set of background, Mark, and a complete non-answer on what the new questions will be, which is very appropriate considering our role in this process to support and facilitate that public conversation and engagement. A couple of other interesting pieces are we have one of the longest censuses in the world, one of the most comprehensive censuses in the world, and it's kept getting longer. It's very rare that anything comes out of a census, and topics have been added in over the 111 years of census taking we've now had in Australia. But what we've seen as we've gone online is that people are actually finding their perceived burden of a census being less. We see a lot in comments and people saying, actually, that didn't take long at all. Why didn't you ask more questions? Why did you shorten the census, which we didn't? And so there is a kind of potential opportunity there that people will be able to be happy to participate and provide further information. And some of the trends we sort of see in census taking is we need the census to create great data. We need the census to be as inclusive as possible for the population. We're always balancing out for how many questions to ask about people and how many questions to ask about dwellings. I do feel like dwellings have been a little bit of a poor cousin in recent decades, and so maybe there'll be a little bit more interest in the dwelling side as we go forward with the census. But certainly last time we had 450 submissions into the process, and something like, I don't know, not quite 100 new topic ideas to add to the 40 odd that we have in the current census. So we're certainly looking forward to seeing what you bring forward as ideas and suggestions, and we'll try and accommodate what we can, and to make 2026 census an even greater census.
Great. Well, thank you. I think we'll leave the questions there, but as you can see, we do have an email account that you can send any questions that you might have after the meeting today, client.services@abs.gov.au. And if you'd like to, very happy to take questions as in my role as the Tasmanian SPM. If you want to reach out, I'm always happy to have a chat. But I might hand back to Duncan to wrap us up today, if that's okay.
Excellent. All right. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I think we had nearly 150 registrations for today's session, so great to see such interest in the census data. And have a great day, and look forward to seeing you around Hobart soon. Cheers.